April 29, 1945. It was a Sunday morning that should have been peaceful with the sound of church bells, but in the outskirts of Munich, it bore the ashen gray of cinders and the biting chill of a late spring frost. The heavy, rhythmic footsteps of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Thunderbirds, crunched through the thin layer of snow as they advanced toward a massive complex. Among the ranks were faces that were still very young. They were farm boys from the Midwest, skilled laborers from Detroit, or students fresh out of school. They marched with an unusually light-hearted spirit. News from the front lines reported that Hitler was nearing death and German forces were fleeing across all fronts. They imagined this morning's mission would merely be seizing a food supply warehouse or an abandoned military parts factory. They carried an innocent belief that they were about to return home after a liberation that was nearing its end. But the reality was many times more brutal. They were not fighting an ordinary battle. They were walking straight into the greatest gates of hell of the 20th century, the Dachau concentration camp. As they neared the boundary of the complex, the unit's pace abruptly slowed. Before them lay a long stretch of railroad tracks, and upon them sat a train of 39 cattle cars, lying silent like a dead, giant metal monster. Not a single sound emanated from those wagons. The wind whistled through the gaps in the rotting wood, carrying a stench so thick it felt solid, the overwhelming smell of decomposing corpses mixed with filth, flooding the lungs of the soldiers. A young lieutenant, his hands trembling, approached the first car. He used the butt of his rifle to pry open the latch. The wood screeched hauntingly as the door swung wide. A horrific scream from his throat tore through the silent Sunday morning air. The sight inside was not meant for human eyes. Thousands of bodies, men, women, and even children, were piled on top of one another like heaps of industrial waste. These were not ordinary corpses, they were withered skeletons covered only by a thin layer of ashen skin. Their eyes, those who had drawn their last breath in extreme hunger and thirst, still stared blankly into the void like an accusation of crime. But the most horrifying thing that made the American soldiers shudder were the painful bite marks on the arms and legs of the corpses. In the final moments of desperation, when life was backed into a corner, the living had tried to eat the dead to scavenge a few more minutes of fading life. That train carried no cargo, it carried the total collapse of humanity. The soldiers of the 45th Division were not novices. They were seasoned veterans who had tasted the fire and brimstone of the Italian theater, crawled through minefields in France, and watched their comrades blown to pieces right beside them. They thought they had seen all the cruelties of war. Yet, before the death train at Dachau, all their psychological barriers of steel shattered. A 19-year-old boy from Oklahoma, noted for being the toughest in the squad, suddenly dropped his machine gun, slumped onto the filthy snow, and sobbed like a child. His crying was not out of fear, but out of absolute loathing for what human beings could do to one another. At the other end of the train, another soldier leaned against the car, vomiting violently, his body shaking in spasms from the immense psychological shock. The atmosphere was no longer that of a victorious march. It was heavy, gloomy, and choked with the scent of death. Young faces suddenly aged 10 years. They looked at their own hands, then at the piles of bodies, and suddenly realized that the world they knew had completely vanished behind the doors of those train cars. However, that weakness lasted only a moment. Very quickly, the grief and loathing were incinerated by another flame, stronger and more devastating: fury. This was no ordinary anger, but a cold, dark, lethal intent. The soldiers began to grip their rifle stocks tightly, their eyes no longer brimming with tears but streaked with the bloodshot veins of hatred. They looked toward the SS guard tower standing tall behind the barbed wire, looking at the German guards standing there in neat uniforms with full bellies. The contrast between the civilized guards and the waste-like piles of bodies ignited the most primitive instinct: revenge. In that moment, every lecture on the Geneva Convention, every rule about the humane treatment of prisoners of war, completely evaporated from the minds of the American soldiers. They no longer viewed those wearing SS uniforms as enemy servicemen. In their eyes, they were monsters that needed to be exterminated immediately. "We didn't come here to take prisoners," the grinding of a soldier's teeth echoed through the thick, misty air. "We came here to clean out this hell." The liberation of Dachau began not with handshakes or smiles, but with a silent vow of a bloody purge about to unfold. Under the looming shadows of the Dachau guard towers, a chilling atmosphere, thick with hatred, enveloped the 45th Division. The American soldiers who had just walked past the death train were no longer the cheerful young men of yesterday. Their eyes were hollow, yet deep within them burned a fury waiting to erupt. In this moment, every dogma regarding military ethics and the clauses of the Geneva Convention suddenly became laughable, luxurious, and meaningless. How could one speak of humanity to those who had turned fellow human beings into piles of dry bones? In hands trembling with rage, Garand rifles and Thompson submachine guns were no longer defensive weapons used to end a war, they had transformed into swords of justice, tools of ultimate judgment. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, a seasoned commander, sensed the danger lurking within his own ranks. He shouted until his voice went hoarse, "Keep moving. Don't look at that train anymore. Move out." But his orders fell into a void. The 2,300 withered corpses on those train cars had already taken root in the minds of every soldier, becoming a haunting specter that chased away whatever reason remained. At the main gate of the concentration camp, a ridiculous and ironic scene unfolded. SS Lieutenant Heinrich Wicker stepped out, appearing like an entity from another world. Amidst a Dachau filled with mud, corpses, and stench, Wicker wore a polished gray uniform, leather boots buffed to a deep black shine, and held a white flag symbolizing surrender. He walked with the air of an aristocrat, arrogant and conceited. What did Wicker expect? He expected a formal handover ceremony, a military salute from the Americans, and the protection afforded to an officer according to the international rules of the game. He believed that a white flag and a social smile could wash away the earth-shattering atrocities behind him. But he was wrong. Facing him were not elegant veterans at a negotiation table, but American soldiers simmering with vengeful blood. When the American officer looked at Wicker's healthy, well-fed face, then glanced at the piles of dry corpses scattered on the snow just behind him, disgust rose to the back of his throat. There was no salute, and no agreement was signed. The American officer stepped forward, looked the Nazi straight in the eye, and spat a glob of pure contempt into that clean face. It was the end of all negotiations. At that second, every rule of diplomacy officially shattered. The camp gates burst open. Chaos exploded like a volcanic eruption. Over 30,000 living skeletons, prisoners who had been stripped of their dignity for years, poured out. They screamed, they laughed and cried hysterically, they called out, "Americans! Americans," in raspy voices. Bony embraces and tears rolling down gaunt faces created a scene that was both epic and agonizing. But while the prisoners cheered for their freedom, deep within the corners of the camp, the American soldiers had begun their hunt. They no longer waited for orders. They scoured every warehouse, every guard tower. Scattered gunfire rang out everywhere. Anyone wearing an SS uniform became prey. At the coal yard, a scene even more horrific was taking place. Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead, a soldier of Native American descent with a naturally strong heart, stood trembling before the row of crematoriums. Heat still radiated from the steel furnace doors, and inside, the bone ash of unfortunate souls still lingered. The smell of burning hair and scorched flesh clung to his uniform. Before him stood about 50 SS soldiers lined up against a brick wall. They held their hands high, babbling meaningless phrases, "Hitler kaputt. Hitler is finished. We were only following orders." They hoped those words would be their protective charm. Bushyhead looked at them, healthy, fat men in a kingdom of the starving. He looked at his soldiers, who were watching him, waiting for a signal. His silence was more terrifying than any sentence. He gave a slight, quiet nod, a nod that entrusted the fate of 50 human beings to death. Immediately, a gunner nicknamed WWII took his position. The mechanical clatter of the .30 caliber machine gun rang out in the stillness. WWII did not blink. A sharp burst of fire tore through the air, lasting exactly 10 seconds. Those were 10 seconds of the most brutal judgment. The muzzle flashes illuminated the terrified faces of the Germans before they collapsed like felled trees. As the hazy gun smoke gradually cleared, a bloody scene emerged in the coal yard. The bright red of blood stained the snow, which was already black with coal dust. The corpses lay piled upon one another, ending the thousand-year empire's arrogance with a shameful conclusion. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, hearing the sustained automatic fire, came running in a panic. He was stunned by the sight before him, a mass execution without trial. He rushed to WWII, intending to shout a reprimand, but he stopped abruptly. The machine gunner was slumped beside his weapon, hands over his face, tears rolling down cheeks stained with gunpowder. He wasn't crying out of regret, but because a suppressed bitterness had exploded. "Colonel, they deserved it. Did you see what was in the crematoriums? Did you see the train cars?" WWII's sobbing echoed painfully. Sparks stood frozen. He looked into the scarred eyes of the young soldier, then at the heap of SS corpses. He realized that in this hell, the boundary between a liberating soldier and a vengeful one had been completely erased. The justice of that day was not written in ink on paper, it was written in blood and immediate retribution. When the steel gates of Dachau collapsed under the weight of American armored vehicles, a horrific scenario began, one that no military textbook had ever predicted. This was no ordinary reception of prisoners. From the dark barracks reeking of death, tens of thousands of people, or rather, walking skeletons, began to pour out. Some were so weak that their spindly legs, like dry twigs, could not support their body weight. They crawled, they dragged themselves, and they clung to one another to move toward the light. But the moment they saw the SS guards tremblingly dropping their weapons to surrender, a surge of primal energy, an adrenaline of survival and hatred, exploded. People who seemed to be on the brink of death suddenly possessed extraordinary strength. They were no longer victims, in that moment, they transformed into vengeful ghosts returning from the afterlife. The revenge did not take place with firearms or humane shots from a distance. It happened with bare hands, with teeth, with shovels, and with anything they could scavenge from the filthy ground of the concentration camp. At the foot of Guard Tower B, a group of prisoners surrounded an SS soldier who was trying to hide. They dragged him down from the ladder with overwhelming force. There were no gunshots, only the sound of violent impacts and the soul-piercing screams of the perpetrator. Bony hands, which usually only held bowls of thin, mud-scented soup, now tightened around the enemy's throat. They used bricks to smash arrogant faces and used entrenching shovels to rain down years of suppressed rage upon the heads of the butchers. The scene was unbelievably brutal and primal. Those who were once the architects of hell, who had nonchalantly pushed women and children into gas chambers, were now being literally torn apart by their own victims. It was not an execution, it was a purification by blood. Standing not far away, the soldiers of the 45th Division stood as motionless as steel statues. They did not intervene, they did not interfere, and they did not turn away. A few soldiers quietly pulled out cigarettes and lit them, the white smoke mingling with the cold morning mist. Their eyes burned with a cruelty that was chillingly indifferent as they observed the massacre unfolding before them. A young officer, still clinging to some sense of military discipline, looked toward his superior and asked in a trembling voice, "Sir, should we stop them? This is truly too barbaric." The old commander did not look at him, his eyes remained fixed on a prison guard being trampled by the crowd. He took a long drag of his cigarette, exhaled into the void, and replied in a deep, emotionless voice, "No. Do nothing. Let them finish this. They have the right to do it." In that moment, the commander's order was the official declaration that international law had been suspended at Dachau. Justice at this time did not lie in the hands of judges in Geneva or Washington, it lay in the bloodied, skeletal hands of the prisoners. During that fateful hour, Dachau sat entirely outside the map of human civilization. There was no army, no government, no laws of war. There were only two sides, the evildoers and the victims exercising their ultimate right of judgment. The air was filled with the screams of those being executed, mingled with the choked sobs of those who had just found their freedom through vengeance. The SS soldiers, who had always prided themselves on discipline and strength, were now nothing more than shredded meat under the feet of those they once deemed subhuman. As time passed and the fury gradually subsided, Dachau left behind a scene of desolation that no camera lens could fully capture. The prisoners slumped down beside the corpses of their enemies, their eyes hollow, their breath ragged. They had just committed a barbaric act, but strangely, in that barbarity, they felt, for the first time, that they had become human again, humans with the right to reclaim a blood debt. Justice from bare hands had ended, leaving a scar that would never heal in the souls of both the victors and the vanquished. The fury at Dachau had barely subsided when another war began, this one on paper. Film rolls hastily developed in military darkrooms revealed a shocking truth: American soldiers of the 45th Division had not just liberated prisoners, they had directly executed guards. Photos capturing SS soldiers falling at the base of brick walls, corpses piled in the coal yard, and images of American soldiers standing coldly with weapons in hand became indisputable evidence. An investigation team led by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker was quickly established. They interviewed witnesses, collected evidence, and compiled a report dense with allegations of international law violations. The report, titled "Investigation of Alleged Mistreatment of German Guards at Dachau," was sent directly to the desk of one of the most powerful and short-tempered generals in U.S. history, George S. Patton. 2. The confrontation in the Iron General's office. Patton, a man famous for iron discipline and an extreme fastidiousness, who might strip a soldier of his rank just for unpolished boots, sat in silence before that file. He leafed through each page, his eyes narrowing under his polished helmet. The investigating officer stood before him, solemnly emphasizing that the actions of the 45th Division were war crimes, and a flagrant violation of the Geneva Convention. But Patton wasn't listening. His mind was not on dry legal text. He was staring at the photos of the 39-car train filled with corpses, the crematorium still dusted with human bone ash, and the faces of his criminal American soldiers, men who had been forced to witness hell on earth before pulling the trigger. Suddenly, Patton slammed his hand onto the desk, a sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. He stood up abruptly, his face flushed with rage. He roared, his voice booming throughout the command office, "War crimes. You call this war crimes? You want my men to flip through military textbooks to find ways to behave politely after they just walked past 2,000 rotting corpses on a ghost train? You expect that from flesh and blood human beings? Not a chance." 3. The fire that dissolved punishment. To Patton, this report was not justice, it was an insult. He considered it immoral to court-martial soldiers who had just liberated tens of thousands of lives simply because they had finished off Nazi monsters. He saw in it a ridiculous contradiction: the world wanted them to destroy demons, but expected them to do it with perfectly clean hands. Patton turned to the investigating officer, his gaze as cold and determined as when ordering the movement of armored divisions. "Do you know what you are asking me to do?" Patton demanded. "You are telling me to turn heroes into criminals." To the astonishment of everyone in the room, Patton performed a shocking act. He grabbed the thick file, the brutal photographic evidence, and threw it all into the blazing fireplace, or according to some accounts, he personally tore them to shreds and ordered the complete destruction of all traces of the investigation. The pages of accusations charred, curled, and vanished into ash amidst the flickering flames. 4. The conclusion of a historic verdict. Patton's verdict was simple: there would be no trial. He chose to protect his soldiers, choosing to stand with a profoundly human fury rather than rigid legal clauses. Even Supreme Commander Eisenhower, upon hearing the report, maintained an understanding silence. They understood that on that fateful day at Dachau, the line between good and evil had been strangled to the point where no court could clearly define it. The charges were dropped. The soldiers of the 45th Division returned home, carrying medals and horrific memories they would never recount. By incinerating the report, Patton did more than save his men's careers. He sent a steel-hard message to posterity: there are some hells where vengeance is the only justice that makes sense. The liberation of Dachau and the subsequent retaliations are not merely a somber note in military history, but a complex riddle of ethics and humanity. In terms of historical significance, Dachau stands as the most definitive evidence of the ultimate brutality of Nazism. The fact that American soldiers boiled over and executed guards blurred the line between conventional warfare and a moral purge. General Patton's decision to destroy the investigation files carries immense symbolic weight. It demonstrates that in extraordinary circumstances, justice cannot be administered through dry legal documents alone, but must be rooted in an understanding of human suffering. It also protected the honor of the liberators, preventing heroes from being turned into criminals simply for an instinctive reaction to pure evil. The fragile boundary of humanity: when confronted with absolute evil, even the most virtuous people can become avengers. It teaches us that morality is not an immutable constant but is always tested by reality. The danger of silence and blind obedience. The SS guards at Dachau often pleaded that they were only following orders. The lesson here is that every individual must bear responsibility for their own moral conduct. Obedience cannot serve as a shield for crimes against humanity. Justice and compassion. Patton's verdict teaches us that the law exists to serve humanity, not to imprison compassion. Sometimes, understanding the root cause of an action is more important than the mechanical application of statutes. Dachau reminds the world that to prevent hell from being reborn, we need more than just military might. We need a vigilant conscience to ensure we are not consumed by the very hatred that evil sows.